Gary said, you know, we've seen a little bit of movement between the environmental health folks and occupational health folks in terms of getting together. And in terms of joining women's health advocates to that conversation, we're a bit late hitting the ground on that. So I'm really excited about being able to do this and being able to do it in a context where we have a good group of workers with us, and we're gaining that expertise, and we're building out a stronger social movement from this. So I'm excited about the design of that. No. You know, it's not that big of a deal. I tried to put on a slide for you the definitions in the legal text of the precautionary principle, but I can talk to you without it. So the basic point I want to say today is related to the regulation of worker health and safety and the extent to which that regime relies on scientific judgments. So our legal regime for regulating these substances incorporates the findings of various scientific bodies and committees as standards or thresholds for exposure related to the regulated substances. We've heard a lot about that today. We also hear regularly that the concept of precaution is a feature of our health and environmental regulation in Canada. And from my perspective, I think that we need to question the extent that's truly the case. And so that's why we have the Science, Law, and the Precautionary Principle on the barriers to change panel and not in the afternoon. At the same time as we say that, I think we need to recognize that the basic spirit of the Precautionary Principle has inspired activists in both the health and safety and the environmental justice movements. And it's causing those people to demand change in regulation and governance models that are significantly transforming the way we approach risk and the regulation of risky activities, including certain types of work. So I'll start with the precautionary principle. Basically, it's been called the defining principle of the modern environmental movement. Over the past 2 or more decades now, it's been embraced by environmental and health advocates all over the world, and increasingly we're seeing campaigns for change framed in this language. Why? The most commonly cited version of the principle goes to the 1992 Rio Declaration, and it basically says that where there are threats to human health or the environment, scientific uncertainty will not be used as an excuse for postponing what they call cost-effective government regulation. It's not the strongest framing of a precautionary principle that we can imagine, but essentially it says that in the face of scientific uncertainty, we can still demand action to prevent these potential harms. Interests that are enjoying the status quo, which is a regime in which regulatory action waits for scientific proof, tend to argue that the precautionary principle is dangerous because it could force regulatory action on perceived risks for which there's no sound scientific basis for alarm, which would unnecessarily stifle economic activity. Its proponents, on the other hand, argue that precaution is necessary to deal with the inherent uncertainties around the effects of certain substances and practices on the environment and in the human body. So what they're trying to move us away from is a model that's been called the traditional or permissive approach to regulation, and this was founded on the assumption that science could fully predict the health and environmental effects of things like exposures to toxic substances. And under that model, governmental intervention to protect health, for example, would only be justified once conclusive evidence showed that exposures would cause harm in the absence of action. And so scientific uncertainty under that model would lead to a sort of regulatory paralysis. I think there are a couple of things going on. One is that we conceived of uncertainty as a lack of data. We thought that it was a situation that arose because we weren't doing enough monitoring or we weren't doing enough studies. In truth, we find that it's a much more pervasive uncertainty, and it's actually inherent to the types of knowledge we're trying to get. And that is knowledge that's at the interface of very complex natural systems, like ecosystems or bodies, and very complex social systems, right? So we're talking about a situation in which there's this complex biological system operating in conjunction with social parameters that are always changing and that are sort of erratic and when we put that situation, those parameters all together, we're not necessarily going to produce simple cause and effect relationships. So as we all know from listening today, the conditions in the plants are not like conditions in a scientific experiment, right? We don't get to isolate one variable and hold all the others constant. And so that's the trouble with trying to bring this science into a regulatory situation. Good. So some people will say, when we talk about the precautionary principle, that we're trying to live in a risk-free world, right? And we hear this all the time. In the very orthodox understanding, people talk about risk as being something that can be measured by means of a formula. They say it's a simple function of the magnitude of the harm and the probability of it transpiring, right? So we know things are risky if they're either the consequence of them happening would be really bad, or if the likelihood of them happening is quite high. And that perspective informs the way we set limits on workplace exposures, or these threshold limit values that we've been hearing about. So these are the kinds of studies that produce recommendations like we will reduce benzene concentrations within plants to a level that will only cause around 9.5 worker deaths per 1,000 by leukemia, but not more, right? And this is, as people have been saying over the course of the day, this is the acceptable risk calculation, which then translates to a part per million or part per billion type of threshold. The important thing to recognize is that most ordinary people, non-experts working in this conventional mode, include other factors in their determination of whether a risk is acceptable or not, beyond the idea of consequence and magnitude. And normally the kinds of things we include are whether the risk is seen as voluntary and whether it's seen as fair. And making judgments on both of those factors involves an assessment of the distribution of the consequences, the costs and the benefits associated with taking the risk. So the expert risk managers calculate these costs and benefits at the level of society as a whole, but they rarely attach much significance to the distributional question of who bears the risk and who bears the cost, essentially. Who bears the cost and who reaps the benefits associated with taking the risk. So the threshold limit values then are these airborne concentration limits for particular substances. They're incorporated into our law by a regulation under the Provincial Health and Safety Act. And those regulations typically set the exposure limits according to two variables, and they are stakeholder input, which is very important, and advice from a committee of experts in industrial hygiene. And this is the ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. As was said in the film, this is sort of a non-profit, private standard-setting body. And so if you think back to the critique in the film of this system, they said, well, it's an economic and technological convenience, right? It's not a scientifically produced standard. And that's quite clear in the legislation that sets up where we're going to draw these standards from and how we're going to base them on stakeholder input. I think we've done a great job today of talking about how the development of these threshold limit values is flawed, but just to reiterate a couple things. Of course, the ACGIH is a non-profit professional association, so it's subject to the critiques that it lacks independence from industry and industry money. The system, of course, is based on these individual numerical limits, so they can't deal with the chemicals in synergy with each other. They're individually set per chemical. It's a standard-setting process that doesn't take adequate account of gender. So it doesn't take into account, for example, these windows of vulnerability that we now know are very important in terms of how endocrine disruptors affect people's health. And it's also a methodology that can't really appreciate the mechanism of endocrine disruption, which, as Michael describes, presents a profound challenge to the idea of thresholds to begin with. And finally, it's a regulatory approach that relies on inspections, which we know and have heard are few and far between and are complicated by the power dynamic that Sari mentioned. So what would a more precautionary approach be? It would require us taking positive steps to protect human health where there's reason to believe that harm is occurring. even when the scientific evidence is lacking, uncertain, contested, whatever. So for many of these exposures, it means talking to and consulting with workers about their day-to-day concerns. As Karen said, in light of the pressures that they're facing in the workplace, and just simply getting to work on reducing the exposures in an absolute sense, right? Not measuring and trying to reduce them below some certain arbitrary threshold amount. So we have to be thinking about changes to the regulatory scene that are much broader than the occupational health and safety scene alone. We know that many of these substances are also regulated federally in Canada under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And notwithstanding the fact that precaution has been a feature of that legislation since 1999, it follows the very same chemical by chemical, threshold-based process of risk assessment that can't pay attention to gender or windows of vulnerability, etc. So in our system, which is different from Europe's REACH system, which we'll hear from Andrew a little bit about this afternoon, these chemicals are permitted to remain on the market unless and until the scientific evidence or proof is in place to add them to our list of toxic substances. And even when that happens, the government maintains a considerable amount of discretion in the choices they make in terms of limiting our exposure to those substances. So unless the substance is completely banned from being manufactured or imported, as Michael said, none of those actions at the federal level are ever going to translate into improvements in the workplace. That is, they don't automatically trigger changes in the threshold limit values that are within the provincial legislation. That's really all I wanted to get across today. The legal regime here in Canada is inadequate. We have to think much more broadly about it. We want to open up the conversation this afternoon for these kinds of regulatory innovations or alternative